An officer was patrolling the mountain road alone until he saw something moving in the snow. 2 shadows. 2 dogs. Tied. Shivering. Abandoned. One had a scar over his eye, the other couldn't even stand. When he looked closer, he realized they weren't just strays. They were former K9 heroes, and someone had left them to die. What happened next will break your heart, and slowly stitch it back together. Before we begin, tell me, where are you watching from? Drop your country in the comments. Let's see how far this story can travel. And if you believe no loyal dog should ever be discarded like broken equipment, hit that subscribe button. Because this isn't just a story about rescue, it's about redemption, second chances, and the quiet love that saves us all. The wind howled through the Wasatch Mountains like a chorus of lost souls. Snow fell in great silencing sheets, blanketing the steep, winding roads in ghostly white. The town of Summit Glen, tucked deep in northern Utah, had all but disappeared under the storm's weight. Pines bent under the weight of powder, and visibility barely stretched beyond 10 feet. This wasn't the kind of day for anyone to be out, especially not alone. Deputy Ryan Callahan steered his police-issued SUV slowly along the icy mountain road. Chains clanked faintly on the tires as they carved through the drifts. Ryan, 35, had the kind of face that once smiled often, but now held a quiet stillness. His jaw was square and rough with stubble, his sandy brown hair hidden beneath a black beanie. A long scar ran just beneath his left eye, barely visible unless you knew to look. Tall and broad-shouldered, he had the posture of a man always ready for what comes next. But today, beneath the uniform and badge, he was someone else, a grieving husband. In the passenger seat beside him sat a small cedar box plane, engraved only with the initials EC. Ella Callahan had been gone for 7 months. She'd died in a rockslide on this very mountain, trying to hike to the summit one last time before winter set in. Ryan had been late that day, responding to a domestic call in the valley. By the time he got her last voicemail, it was too late. The snow had already started. The mountain had already moved. Since then, he hadn't set foot back up here until today. He wasn't just patrolling. He was carrying out a promise, to spread her ashes where she always felt most alive. His thoughts were broken by the radio's static flickering, then fading. Too high up, no signal. He reached forward and turned the knob off. Silence. Then he saw it. Something low to the ground, off the side of the road where the trail met an old wooden bridge, a shape curled into the snow. At first he thought it was debris. Then it moved. Ryan slammed the brakes. He threw on the emergency lights, grabbed his heavy coat, and stepped into the storm. The snow came sideways now, a biting wall of ice. He jogged toward the bridge, boots crunching over frozen gravel. As he neared, he saw them 2 dogs. They were tied to the lower rail of the wooden bridge with a frayed rope that had long frozen solid. The larger of the 2, a black and tan German shepherd, lifted his head weakly and let out a guttural growl, lips barely twitching back from teeth caked with snow. His body was hunched protectively over the smaller dog, a female, lighter colored, possibly sable, and much thinner. Her body barely moved beneath the snow, save for the flicker of one ear. Ryan stopped a few feet away, crouched slowly, and whispered, "Easy now, boy. I'm not here to hurt you." The male dog growled again, low and hoarse, but didn't lunge. His body trembled from the cold, but he stayed over her, shielding her from the wind like a soldier refusing to abandon his post. "God," Ryan muttered, heart lurching. "Who the hell would do this to you?" He edged closer, watching the male's eyes deep amber, wary but not wild. They were trained, intelligent, familiar. Ryan had worked with K9 units in his early career down in Salt Lake. He knew that look. "You're police, aren't you?" he said softly. The shepherd didn't answer, of course, but something in his gaze settled, as if he understood. Ryan knelt beside them. The cold burned through his gloves as he began untying the rope, ice snapping off in sharp crystals. The female didn't move. Her breaths were shallow and spaced. Ryan removed his jacket and wrapped it around her. We're getting you out of here, both of you." He lifted her first light as a sack of bones, ribs too sharp under his arms. Then he turned to the male. The dog looked at him, looked at her, then slowly stood and followed. Back in the SUV, the heater blasted. Ryan laid the female dog scout. He decided on the back seat and turned the front vents toward the male Shadow, for the way he had moved, silent and loyal. Shadow sat beside the ashes. Ryan glanced down at the box. "I guess we're not going alone after all, Elle." The storm raged on as he turned the car round. Behind him, the mountain held its breath. The storm relented slightly by the time Deputy Ryan Callahan reached the edge of Summit Glen's town center. The sky was still a dull, weighty gray, but the snowfall had slowed to a silent drift, flakes dancing like exhausted ghosts. He turned into a narrow side street, tires crunching over packed snow, headlights reflecting off frosted window panes. At the end of the block stood a squat brick building with a faded wooden sign. Summit Glen Veterinary Clinic, Estent 1957. Ryan parked, killed the engine, and glanced into the back seat. Scout was curled under his jacket, her breathing shallow but steadier. Shadow sat beside her, unmoving, his eyes locked on Ryan as if awaiting further instruction. "Hang in there," Ryan murmured. He carried Scout into the clinic, Shadow limping close behind. Inside, warm air filled with the faint smell of antiseptic and cedar greeted them. A bell chimed above the door. A woman emerged from a side hallway, wiping her hands on a towel. She looked to be in her mid-40s, tall and angular with streaks of silver in her auburn ponytail. Her name tag read Dr. May Whitaker. Her expression, though tired, was alert and deeply empathetic, the kind carved by years of dealing with both hope and heartbreak in equal measure. "Deputy Callahan?" she asked, her voice calm but curious. Ryan gave a short nod. "Found them on Timberline Pass, tied to the bridge in the storm. I think they were left to die." May's jaw tightened, but she said nothing. Instead, she stepped aside and motioned him into a nearby exam room. The space was small and tidy, with warm lighting and a thick rubber mat on the floor. Scout whimpered softly as Ryan placed her on the table. Shadow paced once, then sat beside the table, eyes following May's every move. As May worked checking Scout's temperature, heart rate, and reflexes, Ryan stood back, arms crossed tightly over his chest. The warmth of the room brought color back to his cheeks, but it couldn't thaw the slow churning in his chest. "She's malnourished," May murmured, more to herself. "Underweight, signs of dehydration. That scar on her leg, it's old, but not well treated." She glanced up at Ryan. "The male's in better shape, but he's also protective, not aggressive. That's unusual for a stray." "I don't think they're strays," Ryan said. "Look under the skin on their necks." May raised a brow, pulled a scanner from a drawer, and gently passed it over Scout's scruff. The device beeped. She froze. "Well, I'll be damned." Ryan stepped closer. "ID chip," she said. "Registered. K9 Division, Arkansas State Police." She scanned Shadow. Another beep. "Same." Ryan exhaled through his nose, slow and sharp. "That's across state lines." May tapped into her computer. Her fingers flew across the keyboard, brow furrowing. Their names were Shadow and Scout, both part of a tactical K9 team. But their files are marked. She stopped, eyes scanning the screen. Both were declared missing nearly 14 months ago, presumed lost in action during a flood response mission. Status? Not recovered. Ryan blinked. Not recovered? That's bureaucratic code for forgotten. Worse, May said quietly. It means someone gave up on them. Silence settled between them. Scout let out a soft whine and reached toward Ryan's hand with her nose. It was tentative, uncertain. Ryan didn't move. Then she licked his glove just once and laid her head down, her body pressed into the crook of his arm. May noticed. "She's bonded to you." "Not sure why," he said, voice low. "She barely let me near her at first. She's trauma-wired, likely abused or neglected after service. When dogs are used and discarded, they lose their bearings. But every now and then, someone shows up, and they decide that's their person. Shadow padded closer and nudged Ryan's leg. Ryan sighed. Guess I've been picked. As May stepped away to prepare fluids and nutrition supplements, Ryan's gaze wandered to the frost-covered window. Snow continued to fall outside. Soft, persistent. And with it, a memory stirred, one he'd buried beneath long hours and badge duty. 7 months ago, he had been at the station. A blizzard warning had come in early. Ella had texted him, saying she was going to hike the lower ridge one last time before the storm. "Just an hour," she'd said. "It clears my head." He'd promised to meet her, but a domestic dispute in the trailer park took longer than expected. By the time he'd arrived, the trail was buried. Her body wasn't found for 2 more days. It wasn't the avalanche that haunted him. It was her voicemail. "I can see the sun breaking through the clouds. It's beautiful up here, Rye. I wish you could see this with me." He hadn't listened to it since. Now, in a strange twist of fate, 2 creatures who'd also been left behind in a storm were clinging to life beside him. When May returned, Ryan asked, "You'll keep them here overnight?" She nodded. "I'll monitor Scout closely. Shadow should stay nearby. I have room." Ryan hesitated, then reached down to pet Shadow. The dog leaned into it. "I'll be back tomorrow." May glanced at him. "Ryan, if you hadn't found them," he shook his head. "I did." Then he turned and left. Outside, snow coated the streetlights and dark rooftops like icing. Ryan got into his SUV, the cedar box still beside him. He looked at it, then at the clinic door. Maybe we were all supposed to come back down this mountain together. Snow crunched beneath Ryan Callahan's boots as he climbed the short steps to his front porch, a duffel bag slung over one shoulder and a leash in each hand. The early morning light cast long blue shadows across the mountainside, and the air was thick with the smell of pine and fresh frost. Behind him, Shadow padded steadily, ears pricked and alert, his coat glistening with melting snow. Scout walked closer to Ryan's side, her pace slower but steadier than the day before. A faint pink bandage peeked from beneath the short fur on her back leg, where Dr. Whitaker had treated a half-healed scar. Ryan's cabin sat alone on the northern slope of Timberline Ridge, about 15 minutes from the main road. It was a modest log home with a green tin roof, a stone chimney, and a wraparound porch that faced the rising sun. The windows were tall, framed with thick cedar planks, and the surrounding yard was half buried under a soft white blanket. He hadn't been back up here since summer since the funeral, but this morning something had compelled him to return. Inside, the air was cold but clean. He dropped his bag near the door and led the dogs inside. Scout sniffed cautiously, while Shadow walked the perimeter like a soldier clearing a room. Ryan lit the fireplace, stacked dry wood, and stirred the embers until a steady flame bloomed in the hearth. Warmth began to creep into the room, slow and comforting. After feeding the dogs and settling them on thick old quilts beside the fire, Ryan sat at the kitchen table with his laptop open and a mug of black coffee cooling beside him. The house was quiet, save for the occasional crackle of the fire and the soft thud of Scout's tail when Ryan passed by. He began drafting the message. To National K9 Registry, K9 Identification and Recovery Division. Subject, urgent, recovered active, K9 units, possible misconduct. He included the chip ID numbers, photographs, and a summary of what he knew so far. The location where he found them, the condition they were in, and the concerning fact that both had been marked missing, despite being very much alive. He hesitated before writing his final sentence. I have reason to believe these dogs were intentionally abandoned. Ryan hit send. Later that afternoon, just as the sun dipped behind the ridge and cast the sky into bands of orange and mauve, there came a knock at the door. Ryan opened it to find a familiar figure standing on the porch bundled in a knitted shawl and wool gloves. Olivia Brooks, his neighbor from down the slope. Olivia was 82 years old, short and sprightly with steel-gray curls and a cane carved from hickory wood. Her face was lined with stories, and her voice always carried a hint of dry mischief. She had been a teacher for 40 years and now spent her days gardening, reading mystery novels, and spoiling every stray animal within a 5-mile radius. "Well, I heard the wind whisper that you were finally back," she said with a raised brow, "and I smelled wet dog." Ryan chuckled and stepped aside. "Come in, Liv. I've got coffee and a heater." "Thank heavens." She stepped inside, pausing the moment she spotted Shadow. Her sharp eyes narrowed. "Where'd you find that one?" she asked, her voice lower now. Ryan explained everything: the bridge, the storm, the chips, the vet's report. Olivia walked over to Shadow and squatted slowly, eye to eye. Shadow didn't move, but his ears tilted slightly forward. She reached out a hand, and after a moment the big shepherd lowered his head into her palm. "I've seen you before," she whispered. "You were on the news, back in 21, Utah mine collapse. You pulled a man from under 14 feet of rubble." Ryan blinked. "You're sure?" "As sure as my hip still hurts when it rains." Olivia stood and dusted off her knees. "They called him Shadow then, too. There was a photo. I remember those eyes." Ryan looked at Shadow again. So many pieces. So few answers. They sat at the kitchen table afterward, Ryan pouring Olivia a cup of chamomile tea, while Scout lay beside the fireplace, softly snoring. Olivia told him stories of the dogs she'd known, about how some came back from war unable to trust again, and others who only needed one person to show them they were worth saving. Then, just as Olivia was preparing to leave, a sound cut through the stillness, the deep, sharp bark of Shadow. Ryan turned in time to see the dog bolt to the front window, hackles raised, tail rigid. Ryan moved to the window and saw what Shadow had spotted: a black pickup truck crawling down the forest access road, half concealed by trees. It was older, maybe a 2005 Dodge Ram with no plates and a cracked rear window. The driver's face was obscured by snow and distance. "You recognize that truck?" Ryan asked Olivia. "No," she said, her voice tense, "but I don't like the way it's creeping." Shadow snarled now, nose pressed to the glass. Ryan's gut twisted. "I don't either." The truck disappeared around the bend moments later, swallowed by trees, but something in Shadow's posture remained guarded, on edge. Ryan stared long after the vehicle was gone. The morning after the truck sighting, Ryan Callahan sat in his study, a room lined with old forestry maps, faded photographs, and books collecting dust. A log cracked in the fireplace, sending sparks upward. The kettle on the stove whistled faintly as steam curled above it, but Ryan wasn't moving. His focus was locked on his laptop screen, where a DMV database loaded painfully slow on the patchy mountain Wi-Fi. Last night's black truck had left tracks near the Forest Service road before vanishing into the trees. Ryan had traced those tracks until they faded near a service entrance locked with a rusted chain too old and out of place to belong to any modern agency. The truck had no visible plates, but through binoculars, Ryan had caught the outline of a faded decal on the rear window. This morning, he'd cleaned up the photo, adjusted the contrast, and enlarged it just enough to make out a name: Centurion Tactical K9 Co. Ryan's fingers tightened on the edge of his desk. That company had a reputation, one whispered behind closed doors at police departments and canine units across several states. Rumors of dogs recycled after retirement, of severe training regimens disguised as discipline, of owners who vanished without ever claiming the dogs they trained with. A lawsuit 2 years ago had nearly shuttered the operation, but the company had moved, changed its name slightly, and avoided consequence like oil slipping through fingers. Shadow lay at Ryan's feet, eyes half-lidded but always alert. Scout dozed nearby, her nose twitching in her sleep. The peaceful scene made the truth harder to swallow. Ryan took a breath and grabbed his phone. He called a friend, Deputy Mason Clark, an old academy buddy now stationed down in Carbon County, who had once helped investigate improper canine transfers between agencies. Mason was a wiry man in his early 40s, with short, curly black hair and a voice that always sounded like he was halfway through a laugh. But today, his tone turned serious the moment Ryan mentioned Centurion. "I've heard they're back up here under a shell company," Mason said. We've been trying to track their vehicle registrations, but they've gone dark. You say you saw one near your property? Black Dodge, cracked rear window, no plates. The dog with me. Shadow flipped the moment he saw it. That's no coincidence, Mason muttered. I'll send you what we've got. You be careful, man. If they know you've got those dogs, they might try to get them back. Ryan ended the call, his mind buzzing, when a sudden knock echoed from the front door. On the porch stood Officer Dana Morales, a young woman from the Summit Glen Department. She was in her late 20s, with cropped dark hair, tan skin, and sharp cheekbones that made her look older when she frowned, which was often. She'd always been by the book, highly observant, and, despite her intensity, deeply empathetic toward kids and animals. "Ryan," she said, stepping inside and brushing snow from her shoulders. "We've got a call. A boy's missing, 8 years old. Name's Caleb Whitaker. Last seen yesterday afternoon on the East Ridge Trail." Ryan stiffened. "That's near the ravine." Dana nodded. "Parents thought he was with his uncle. Turns out he went out alone, probably with his sled. There's a search party forming, but the snow last night buried most of the tracks." Ryan glanced at Scout, now awake and alert. Her ears perked as if she understood. "Let me bring Scout," he said. "She's trained. You'll see." They rode in Dana's cruiser to the East Ridge where volunteers, rangers, and 2 K9 teams were already combing the area. The wind howled low, snow still whispering across the ground like a secret. The boy had been missing for nearly 16 hours. In this cold, time was narrowing fast. Scout sniffed the boy's gloves, passed to them by his teary-eyed Mother Janelle Whitaker, a petite woman with deep-set eyes and a tremble in her hands that no amount of blankets could hide. Her husband, Brent, stood beside her, broad-shouldered, with a beard dusted in snow and grief lining every word he spoke. "I just want my son home," Brent said. "He knows these woods, but the cold, he's just a kid." Scout lowered her nose to the snow and took off, slow but confident, weaving between trees with deliberate precision. Ryan followed, leash loose in his hand, while Dana and a ranger trailed behind. It wasn't long before Scout stopped. She barked twice sharp, urgent, and bolted down a steep incline, dragging the leash from Ryan's hand. He shouted her name, but followed close. They descended into a narrow ravine, where the snow had formed deep, uneven mounds. Scout veered left, then right, her body tense and driven. Finally, she skidded to a halt near a fallen log. Beneath it, a flash of red, a mitten. Ryan dropped to his knees and brushed the snow away. Caleb, the boy, was curled into himself, pale and shivering, but breathing. His lips were blue, his jacket was soaked, but when Ryan gently lifted him into his arms, Caleb stirred and whispered, "Is that dog real?" Ryan looked back at Scout, now sitting beside them, tail wagging gently. "She's real," Ryan said, "and she's the reason we found you." By the time they got Caleb back to the trailhead, an ambulance was waiting. His parents rushed forward, sobbing, clutching him as medics swarmed around. Scout stood to the side, watching with calm pride. Janelle approached Ryan, her eyes wet but clear. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you." And her. Ryan nodded, hand on Scout's head. "She's got a good nose and a better heart." The snow had settled deep over Timberline Ridge by the time darkness fell that night. The quiet wasn't peaceful. It was too absolute, too still, like the forest itself was holding its breath. Ryan Callahan sat at the dining table with a notebook open, a black pen poised in his hand, but his eyes weren't focused. They drifted repeatedly to the fireplace, where Shadow lay curled like a guardian statue, and Scout, still slightly limping, rested beside him. The day's events weighed on Ryan's shoulders like a flak vest. Caleb's rescue, the company name on the truck, Mason's warnings. Scout had proven herself again, her K9 training undimmed despite the trauma. And now, Ryan felt something more than obligation toward them. He felt responsibility, as if their survival and purpose were now knotted with his own. Earlier that afternoon, Ryan had taken an extra step. He'd installed 2 miniature cameras, one discreetly woven into the collar of Scout, the other clipped under Shadow's tag. Both devices, gifted from a retired tech officer he knew, were motion-activated and synced to a secure cloud storage. Not because he was paranoid, he told himself, but because too much about this felt wrong. At 2:17 a.m., the alarm didn't ring. There was no shatter of glass, only the sound of Shadow's deep, guttural growl slicing through the silence like a blade. Ryan's eyes flew open. He was off the couch and to his feet in seconds, instinct and training snapping into place. He grabbed his sidearm from the drawer by the fireplace and crept through the hallway barefoot. Moonlight leaked through the kitchen window, casting pale squares on the wooden floor. Then came a sharp, desperate yelp Scout's. Ryan burst into the mudroom. There, crouched beside Scout, was a man in black hooded, gloved, and mid-motion with something glinting in his hand. A small device, like a chip reader or a precision scalpel. "Freeze!" Ryan shouted. The man didn't freeze. He lunged. But Shadow was faster. From the side hallway, the big German Shepherd exploded forward like a cannon shot. His body slammed into the intruder's torso, knocking the man sideways into the coat rack. A crash of metal and fabric filled the room. The man swung wildly, landing a blow to Shadow's side, but the dog clamped his teeth onto the man's forearm and held, snarling and unrelenting. Ryan didn't hesitate. He pinned the man's legs and disarmed him in seconds, wrenching the blade from his glove and twisting his arm behind his back. Shadow didn't let go until Ryan gave the command. "Out!" Shadow backed off but stayed low, ears flat, teeth bared. Scout whined behind Ryan, clearly frightened but unharmed. The man beneath him was in his 40s, lean and sinewy, with salt and pepper stubble under his ski mask. His eyes, pale blue, cold and flat, stared at Ryan with more contempt than fear. "You have no idea what you're involved in," the man hissed. "I think I'm starting to," Ryan said. He cuffed the man's wrists with the emergency restraints he kept in the drawer, then stood, breathing hard. He called the county sheriff immediately. By the time Deputy Morales and 2 backup units arrived 20 minutes later, the snow had stopped, but tension still hung in the air like a storm that hadn't finished. Ryan handed over the intruder, now zip-tied to the coat hook, and showed them the small blade, the portable chip reader, and the body cam footage already uploading. Morales raised a brow as she watched Shadow pounce on the replay. "Remind me never to surprise that one." The man refused to give his name, but Morales took him in. Ryan requested surveillance on the cabin for 72 hours, and Morales agreed. The black truck had returned, and not by chance. When the house settled back into silence, Ryan knelt beside Shadow and pressed a hand gently to the dog's side. "You okay, boy?" Shadow looked up with calm certainty and licked the back of Ryan's hand. "You saved her," Ryan whispered, glancing at Scout, who had moved closer. "You saved both of us." The first sign of spring in Summit Glen wasn't a flower. It was the sound of water. It dripped steadily from the icicles clinging to Ryan Callahan's cabin eaves, fell in quiet rivulets from the snowbanks, and ran in thin silver streams down the mountain road. The snow hadn't disappeared, but it had begun to soften, to recede, and in that slow melt, the shape of something new began to emerge, change. Inside the cabin, sunlight filtered through the windows, casting a warm gold across the wooden floor. Scout lay curled near the hearth, chin resting on her front paws, eyes half-lidded but tracking every movement Ryan made in the kitchen. Shadow sat with the steadiness of a sentry near the front door, ears alert to each rustle outside, tail occasionally sweeping once across the floor. Ryan stirred a pot of oatmeal absent-mindedly, 2 bowls already set on the ground, one marked with a paw-print-shaped sticker for each dog. He moved with a quiet rhythm, a kind of peace he hadn't felt in years. The mornings had changed. Where once he woke to silence and ghosts, now there was breath and weight and warmth surrounding him. Scout nudging his arm, Shadow laying his chin across Ryan's boot, the steady beat of belonging. The knock on the door that morning came not as a surprise, but as confirmation. Deputy Dana Morales stood there with a man in a dark blue windbreaker, a government seal on the chest. His name was Agent Curtis McGowan, Mid-50s, thick around the waist, with silvering hair and the kind of expression that rarely shifted. He introduced himself with clipped professionalism, his handshake firm but disinterested. "I'm here regarding the individual you detained last week," McGowan said, "and the animals in your custody." Ryan crossed his arms, protective instinct flaring behind his ribcage. "They're not in custody. They're home." McGowan blinked once. "We're not here to remove them. In fact, quite the opposite. Your footage along with the recovered device and incident report has opened a case we've been trying to nail down for months." Dana nodded, adding, "The man you caught is linked to Centurion Tactical. There's evidence he was part of an unlicensed private rehoming operation, what amounts to selling off decommissioned K9s to unverified buyers. Some of those dogs vanished. Others didn't make it." Ryan's jaw clenched. He looked down at Scout and Shadow, both watching in silence from the living room. "What happens now?" McGowan gave a small nod. "There'll be federal charges. And both your dogs, yes, I said yours will be officially listed as survivors. The badges they wore before were revoked when they were marked missing. But, as of today, that status is being reversed." He pulled a small black box from his briefcase and handed it to Ryan. Inside were 2 polished silver-accented medallions. On each, a gold star and the inscription, "K9 Unit, Service and Sacrifice. Reinstated with honor." The same afternoon, a ceremony was held at Summit Glens Town Hall, a stone building with ivy-covered brick and windows dusted with pollen from the first spring thaw. Locals filled the Rose Ranchers in denim and parkas, retired teachers, grocery clerks, and a few wide-eyed children clutching little paper flags. Mayor Alice Raymond, a stately woman in her 60s with a shock of white hair and the presence of a judge, stood at the podium. She had taught debate in the high school for 20 years before politics, and she brought that same crisp gravity to her speeches. "We gather not just to honor bravery," she said, "but to acknowledge what is too often forgotten, those who serve in silence, without voice, without demand. Today, we right a wrong. Today, we say your names again." Ryan walked onto the small stage, not in uniform, but in a gray wool coat. Shadow and Scout followed, both freshly groomed, their new collars gleaming with tags. The moment Ryan knelt to affix the medals, the room rose in a standing ovation. He didn't smile much, not in public, but something in his chest eased. His hand rested on Scout's back, and she leaned into him. Shadow sat beside him, ears up, steady as always. Later that evening, after the town had quieted and the last well-wisher had gone, Ryan returned to his cabin. The medals hung beside the fireplace now, not as trophies, but as reminders. The dogs lay in their usual spots, Scout rolling onto her side, her belly exposed in perfect sleepy trust. Ryan stood by the window, mug of tea in hand, watching the snow drip away from the roof. He thought of all that had been buried and what was beginning to grow underneath. Tomorrow, there would be more to do. Paperwork, follow-ups, maybe more questions from federal agents. But tonight, he let himself breathe. He turned to Scout and Shadow. "We made it through the storm." Shadow's tail thumped once in response. Scout sighed and rested her head on his foot. The mountain trail was half mud, half ice spring pushing against winter in fits and starts. Deputy Ryan Callahan moved with slow, steady steps up the path he once feared he'd never walk again. Slung across his back was a canvas pack. Inside, nestled against an old scarf and a folded letter he had written but never sent, was a cedar box. Smooth, heavy, sacred. Ella's ashes. Scout ran ahead, her sable coat catching the sun between the trees, bounding from snowbank to rocky outcrop. She had healed quickly in the past weeks, her limp now barely noticeable, her spirit fully unshackled. Shadow, by contrast, trotted beside Ryan in silence, his dark form solid and grounded, like a sentinel whose only purpose was to guard and bear witness. The air thinned with altitude. The smell of pine gave way to something clearer cold stone, melting snow, the faint trace of wildflowers not yet in bloom. Each step brought Ryan closer to the ridge, the place Ella loved most. the place he had avoided since the day search crews carried her body down in silence. That day had shattered him, and for a while he let the silence win. But now, he wasn't climbing alone. Earlier that morning, just as he'd been preparing to leave, there was a knock at the cabin door. When he opened it, he found Olivia Brooks standing there, wrapped in a wool shawl the color of ash and wearing her wide-brimmed garden hat despite the lingering frost. In her hands, she held an envelope. "I thought you might want this," she said. "I found it in my old files. A rescue op from back in 21. I didn't realize your Ella was part of that mission." Ryan took the envelope with gentle hands and opened it to reveal a photo slightly curled at the edges, colors faded but unmistakable. There stood Ella in her rescue uniform, goggles on her forehead, mud on her cheek, and joy in her eyes. Her arm was slung around a younger shadow, both of them smiling at something out of frame. The moment shimmered with life. Ryan's breath caught. "You knew she worked with him?" "I didn't. Not until I saw his eyes the night I came over. Then I remembered. That was the first time Shadow made the news." Ryan looked down at the dog who now stood patiently by his feet. "He remembers her, I think. He always did." Now, as they neared the summit, Ryan paused to catch his breath. The view stretched before him in quiet splendor. Hills unrolled into valleys, rivers cutting ribbons through dark green woods. Snow clung only to the highest points now, like the last words of a season refusing to let go. He reached the summit, a flat stone outcropping with a half-buried memorial plaque from a different decade, faded by time. He set his pack down and pulled out the box. For a moment he stood still, box in hand, wind curling around his jacket. Scout stopped her playful running and approached him quietly, nuzzling his leg. Shadow moved forward slowly, then sat straight, composed, still. He didn't look at Ryan. He looked out over the ridge, ears tall, chest lifted, like a soldier at a final post. Ryan opened the box. The wind caught the first drift of ash and carried it outward, swirling into the open sky like smoke from a sacred fire. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. The mountain knew. But inside a vow formed, not loud or dramatic, but strong and certain. "I won't be alone anymore," he whispered. The wind answered with silence. Scout leaned against him. Shadow did not move, as if he understood that this moment wasn't about goodbye, but about continuation. After some time, Ryan placed the box back into his pack, empty now, but no less heavy. He stood with the dogs for several more minutes, watching the wind carry the last flecks of Ella's memory into the sunlit horizon. Then he turned and began the descent. The trail would be easier going down. The burden, somehow, lighter. The forest cabin had changed with the seasons. Where once the porch had been buried in snow, it now caught the morning sun in golden slants, filtering through fresh green leaves. Birds chirped from the branches of aspen and pine, and a faint breeze carried the scent of new grass and damp earth. Ryan Callahan stood barefoot on the wooden porch, steaming coffee in hand, watching Scout chase a butterfly across the open yard like a child tasting joy for the first time. Shadow lay by the front step, his coat glossy in the sunlight, eyes half closed but tracking every movement ever the sentinel. The house behind them was quieter now, not empty but softened, filled with the quiet rhythm of healing. It had been 2 months since Ryan signed the final adoption forms. Scout and Shadow were no longer rescues, no longer strays. They were his. And in that time, Ryan had done more than rebuild a home, he had reshaped a life. He'd left the sheriff's department, turning down an offer for promotion. In its place, he'd opened a private program at the edge of Summit Glen, a small-scale, quiet initiative for children suffering from PTSD, anxiety, or trauma, where K9 companions helped bridge the distance that therapy alone couldn't always reach. The program didn't have a name. It didn't need one. Just a circle of benches beneath the trees, a soft field where paws and feet learned to trust again, and a wooden sign that read, "Come as you are." That morning, the mail arrived late. Olivia brought it up the gravel path herself, her gait slow but steady, cane tapping a rhythm on the stone. She handed Ryan a small envelope, yellowed at the edges with a faded government seal in the corner. "I think this one's waited long enough," she said with a wink. Inside was a letter from the Arkansas K9 unit signed by a now retired commander named Wes Hanley, a stout man with a reputation for hard decisions and soft hands. The note was typed, but the final line was handwritten. "We never stopped wondering what happened to Shadow. I was there the day he pulled 5 men out of the quake zone. One of them was my brother. We owe you and him more than a thank you." Ryan folded the letter gently, then looked down at Shadow. The dog blinked slowly, then rested his head on Ryan's foot, like he understood. That afternoon, Ryan prepared the field for a new class. 5 children, ages 7 to 10, each accompanied by a parent or caseworker. Among them was a little girl named Lila Morgan, age 9, with tightly curled brown hair and wide eyes that rarely made contact. Her mother, Rachel, was in her early 30s, slender, with a quiet, cautious manner. Lila had been in a house fire 6 months earlier. Since then, she hadn't spoken more than a few words at a time. Ryan introduced the children to the dogs one by one. Scout remained close by, watching, waiting. Shadow gave each child a quiet sniff, then sat by the bench line like a soldier on perimeter duty. Ryan demonstrated simple commands, gave them tennis balls, and let them play freely within the marked field. Lila didn't move. She clutched her coat to her chest, shoes planted like roots in the dirt. Her mother knelt beside her, whispering, but Lila only stared at the trees. Then Scout moved. Not quickly, not abruptly, just a slow, careful walk forward, head low, ears relaxed. She stopped a few feet in front of Lila, then lay down, paws outstretched, head resting gently on the grass. For a full minute, nothing happened. Then Lila let go of her coat. Her fingers trembled, and slowly she took one step, then another, and another, until she sat cross-legged beside Scout and placed her small hand on the dog's side. Scout didn't move, but her tail gave one soft thump against the earth. Ryan stood at the edge of the field, arms crossed, the sun warm against his neck. Rachel's eyes were full. She mouthed the words, "Thank you," but said nothing aloud. That evening, after the kids had gone and the dogs rested in their usual places, Ryan took the letter from the K9 unit and tacked it above his desk beside the old photograph of Ella and Shadow. The past hadn't vanished, but it had evolved, softened by new meaning, colored by second chances. The forest breathed around them. Scout lifted her head and nudged his knee. "We're not done yet, are we?" Ryan said, scratching behind her ear. She gave a soft, almost amused huff as if to say, "Not even close." Outside, the first fireflies of spring began to blink into view, quiet miracles, tiny lights against the dusk. Sometimes the most powerful miracles come not in thunder or fire, but in quiet footsteps. A dog's gentle nudge, a second chance given in silence, a broken heart slowly learning to trust again. Shadow and Scout were discarded, forgotten, left for dead, but they became symbols of healing, loyalty, and grace. And through them, Ryan found his purpose again, not because the storm passed, but because love walked through it with him. In a world that often feels cold and chaotic, this story reminds us that God still works through the most unlikely messengers. 4 paws, a warm gaze, and a heart that refuses to give up. If you believe that every soul, human or animal, deserves to be seen, loved, and redeemed, then you're already part of the miracle. Share this story with someone who needs hope today. Comment below where you're watching from, and if this touched your heart, write Amen to let the world know that love still wins. And if you haven't yet, hit that subscribe button because more stories like this are waiting to find you. May God bless you and protect those you love.